Alright, this is the spring installation video for the Mega Cycloneshock. To install this spring, you will need a small Phillips head screwdriver, a small flathead for prying the shell apart if you need to, and then an extra small Phillips head because there is one, basically a half-size screw that goes here, and you'll need an even smaller screwdriver to properly get that out. If you don't have one, you can take your regular screwdriver and sort of jam it in there and get the screw out, but you won't be able to put the screw back. In this blaster, I've actually already misplaced that screw, so just want to let you know this is a small number 1 and this is a 0. You'll need an even smaller screwdriver if you want to get that screw out and reinstall it properly. So putting that aside, I've already taken out all of the visible screws here. I'm going to put them aside here, and underneath, so the first thing you want to do once you get the screws out is remove the slide. And underneath here there are 2 hidden screws, and we're going to get those. We'll just leave that one. And before we go any further, take note of this spring here. It hooks on this peg in the slide, and as you'll see, it will come off when you remove the slide and retract into the blaster. So when we put the blaster back together, we're going to have to stretch that spring out and hook it over this peg. So I'm going to set this aside and gently split the shell. Make sure you don't misplace your dart tooth. These new ones don't have a spring like the, like your Retaliators, Alpha Troopers, so they're a little easier to keep track of. So we're going to split the shell. And with this blaster, it tends to stick right up in this area. So just keep that in mind when you pop your shell off. I'm going to set the top of the shell side. So here's our slide spring. And this is not the stock spring, this is an old prototype, and we're going to replace it with the production spring. So your trigger group comes out just like that. And take note of this piece here that slides back and forth. We don't have to remove it, but I want to show you how that gets installed. So this circular portion points towards you, and same with this hook. It sets in this notch and can move back and forth freely. We're just going to leave that alone for now. I'm going to tilt this plunger mechanism and extract the plunger. There we go. It's a telescoping plunger rod. So let me set this aside, and it's held in by a large pan head screw. So you can see they give you some generous padding here, so when you use this stronger spring, you won't have to worry about plunger damage. This absorbs that impact. You can pop this right off, like that. This is sort of, this cross section is D-shaped, so it only goes on one way. I'm gonna take out the old spring, pop on the new one, line up this D-shaped peg with the plunger, and it's a little tricky to put this on because of the telescoping plunger rod. So you have to compress the spring while holding the plunger rod and press that on, and then while you're doing this, push it firmly down, and while the spring is compressed, grab your screw, compress it down a bit, start the screw in. And there it is. And the screw will pull the plunger rod up onto the head a little to fully seat it. Excuse me. Okay, so this goes in either way. as long as the T is pointing, you know, towards you. So we're going to slide this back into the plunger body, and we're going to push the spring forward and seat it in the shell right here. So it's under a slight compression. You want to be careful because this can pop out when you're trying to place the top of the shell back on. So we're going to put in the trigger group next. Okay, so this is where it gets a bit tricky. You have to get this spring back onto the slide and get the plunger rod into this groove. If you do one and not the other, let's say I get the spring on, then I have to tilt this to get the plunger rod in, the spring can shoot off. So I'm going to put that up, get the plunger rod set. You have to support the bottom of the slide with your hand, if not, it will just fall away. So we're going to support that. Take your screwdriver or needle nose pliers or anything that'll let you get a hold of this spring. Bring that up. Pull it back, drop it onto its post. And push it way down as far as you can get it to go. Oh, sorry, wrong post. This post. There we go. So now while supporting the slide with one hand, you need to get the other half of the shell onto the blaster. If you drop the slide, that spring will most likely shoot off. But luckily, this blaster is pretty easy to get together. Before I do that, let's get a look. Okay, yeah, the dart tooth is actually completely held in place by this rail, so you don't have to worry about the dart tooth. So let's make sure our spring's lined up, make sure the trigger spring is in. This little floating lock is underneath the trigger. And we're going to drop the top of the shell on. So I'm going to press it together in the back first and then work up to the front. It tends to not want to align right here, so you need to pop that in. There we go. And we're still supporting the slide. And this screw that didn't come out, I'm going to put that in first. Hold the two halves of the shell together. Let's get the other hidden screw. Is actually a longer screw. Yeah, and make sure you get the right screws there. The hidden screws are a little bit longer than the rest of the shell screws there. So still supporting the slide because we don't want that spring or the plunger rod to come out. Get that hidden screw in. And now we're going to put the slide together first. Double check to make sure that is in place. Spring's still in place. I'm going to drop that on. And snap those two together. To get them to snap together, you basically half prime. Just pull this back about an inch or so, and the slide will pop together. And once you get that first screw in, you no longer need to support that, so it makes it a lot easier. So we're going to put a couple of screws, we're going to put all the screws into the slide, and then we're going to put a few of the screws up in the front of the blaster and give it a test prime before we get all of the screws in. You want to make sure that you can prime and pull the trigger to verify that none of the locks are tripped or out of place. Alright, so just a couple of screws. We're going to make sure this works. Alright, the cylinder rotated, it locked back, so the cylinder rotating. Let's see if it fires. Alright, we're good to go. And just a side note about the Cycloneshock, the stock plunger seal and the stock O-ring is very, very good. To demonstrate, so it's primed, I'm going to pull the trigger and then turn the cylinder to trip the air restrictor. Hear that? Yeah, that's the air restrictor relieving the pressure from the plunger. So when you fire this blaster while empty, the plunger head won't actually impact the plunger body. It will stop and that air will just sit in there compressed. Okay, so I'm going to put the rest of these screws in and we'll take it over to the chronograph and get some velocity readings. Thanks for watching.